Well, hello and welcome to this session on financial literacy and how the banking revolution plays into that global debate about financial literacy. Delighted to welcome two eminent experts to discuss the topic with me today. It's Anna Maria Lusardi, who is University Professor of Economics and Accountancy at the George Washington University and Academic Director of the Global Financial Literacy Excellence Centre, and also Florent Messi, Executive Secretary of the International Network on Financial Education and Acting Deputy Director of the Directorate for Financial Enterprise Affairs of the OECD. Anna Maria and Florent, welcome. Thank you very much for being with us today. It is a really important dimension, isn't it, of the banking revolution. What happens in terms of people being left behind, if you like? Florent, I wondered if I could start with you, because clearly the pandemic that we've all just been through has accelerated the digital revolution, as we've heard elsewhere in today's event. And obviously that has a lot of consumer benefits, a lot of corporate benefits, but there are potential side effects that we need to be wary of. What has your work at the OECD taught us about the kind of areas that we need to be most concerned about?
Thank you very much, Patrick, and thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure to be here. Yes, indeed. The pandemic has actually accelerated digitalization, and at the OECD, we are doing a considerable amount of work on the benefits and the drawbacks also of this digitalization. This year, we are publishing a flagship publication on artificial intelligence, for example. But coming back to financial literacy, what we see in terms of the digitalization is a number of benefits, as you rightly mentioned, in terms of access to finance, in terms of costs of digital financial services, in terms of more personalized digital financial services, more convenient as well. But also a number of drawbacks that are, in a sense, compounded by the pandemic and the fact that new vulnerabilities have emerged out of the pandemic. And I will mention four of this drawback of digitalization that needs to be addressed by regulation, but also by financial literacy, which is the core of our session today. So the four drawback that we see in our survey, and especially we've done a lot of work this year for the G20 Italian presidency on the exclusion that digitalization is bringing to the table. So exclusion for those who have low digital access, exclusion because of low digital literacy or digital financial literacy, I should say, new types of discrimination as well. AI is making possible for more people to actually access credit, for example, but it also emerged some new types of discrimination, for example, for women or gender, in case the data that is being used in the algorithm is not of high quality. There are also issues around reinforcing behavioral biases. The fact that because financial services are brought digitally, there's easier access, for example, to credit. And it's creating a lot of issues, especially for young generation that are going into debt even before, making a smart financial decision. There are also similar issues around investment products, in a sense, too good to refuse investment offer that are actually speculation and also potentially an issue. And last but not least, and I would like to insist on that, I would say the combination between the pandemic and the fact that part of the population at least is more vulnerable and digitalization has brought some issues around data privacy, confidentiality of data, and in worst case scenario, abuses and frauds. And we've seen that cyber fraud especially has accelerated quite drastically during the pandemic, and it's really a concern for policymakers. So again, we believe at the OECD that regulation and fine financial consumer protection should help, but that financial literacy is in the end the first line of defense, and I would say the best line of defense, because consumers are best able, to judge from their own situation.
Yeah, and I think it's probably fair to say that levels of financial literacy have not increased at the kind of pace that digitalization has increased, failing to keep track, really. Anna Maria, if I could bring you in here, because I know just picking up on one of the things that Florence said there about women and young people. Those are two kind of two constituencies that you have focused on a lot in your academic work because of the vulnerabilities that you have highlighted there. Tell us a little bit about your conclusions.
Yes, thank you very much, Patrick, for inviting me to this event. Delighted to be here. And I want to echo what Florence has said about the effect of the pandemic, digitalizations, and so on. The data, I think, shows that some of the vulnerabilities, first of all, were already present before. So let's not forget that many of these vulnerabilities were not driven necessarily by the pandemic, but they've made a lot more severe. Inequalities and vulnerability, lack of resilience has really come to the surface. And in particularly in two groups, which I think are so important for the economy, which are the young and women. And these are not two small groups. They are more than half of the population. And this is why, as we look forward, we really need to make sure that these groups are building more financial resilience, also because they have been such a support for the economy, particularly women, during this time period. One of the things we have seen during the pandemic is that financial literacy has acted like a shield to protect people against being hit and against kind of the shocks of the crisis. So those with higher financial knowledge are better protected. So we have, I think, an additional benefit from financial literacy, which is, I think, is an important benefit. And as we look forward, as Florence said, we need people to have this first line of defense because, there are government interventions and there are, of course, other initiatives, but people need to have the basic skills and knowledge of crisis. I always say, a sailing lesson show their worth when you are facing a storm. And I think, more than ever now, we need financial literacy to face the storm better and also to face technology better. Here is another, I think, area where, there are groups that can be excluded. For example, those with lower income and lower education, for example, among women and the young. And, technology gives us a lot of opportunity, but also risk. You can now make a bad financial decision just a click away. And so that's why I think more than ever, we need to improve financial literacy, in particularly in these two vulnerable groups.
And just to stay with you for a second, Anna Maria, and then I'd like Florance's thoughts on this point as well. We've been talking about digitalization primarily, but that you talked there about the storm. I assume you're meaning a kind of storm that came from the pandemic, which did, of course, increase the kind of gap between the haves and have-nots, the wealthy and the poor. And there are, of course, greater financial stresses now for large chunks of the world. Is that something that you're focused on in your academic work as well? I'm sure the OECD data on this would be interesting to hear as well.
We are very much focused on this topic on the academic work. And again, I want to say that the research shows that financial literacy is at the basis, for example, of a lot of inequality. So, the fact that there is such a difference in financial literacy contributes to the inequality. And so, this is, again, even more evidence that now that there is this divide and that there are, this inequality have been made even more dramatic, that, we need to address it. And one of the things I really want to say is that any programs or a good start to address these issues is the school. And I think the schools are the ideal place where to do financial education, because there we can reach all of the young, irrespective of their financial status, economic status, whether they are in big city or in small city, and irrespective of gender. And so, if I had to think of what are the recommendations for academic research, is certainly the important role of the school And second, the important role of the workplace as we look at the adult population. And also to look at much more targeted program because personal finance is truly personal and groups have been affected very differently. And so we need different responses to these different groups. So, women with children, which I think are the one for which we see a much higher amount, for example, of financial distress and financial fragility, have different needs and circumstances than, for example, women in the labor force or women with higher income and higher education. So I think we need to take, and I think academic research provide a lot of suggestions on how to make financial education effective. I see that there are questions about but are these programs effective? And I'll be happy to talk more about this. But I think we have seen a lot of evidence, including my own country, Italy, where we are celebrating, for example, this month, Financial Literacy Month, about many of the programs that can be done to help, in particular, the vulnerable group to become more financially literate, but also more financially resilient and improve their financial well-being.
Yes, and of course, I should point out to those in the audience who are not aware, alongside your the hat that you wear in Washington as a eminent academic in this area, you're also working these days in your native Italy, actually implementing a financial literacy strategy on the ground. So you're putting your research into effect.
Yes, thank you. And this, I think, is another way in which we can use research, in a sense, to influence policy. To do so, we have very much followed the recommendation of the OECD, starting with a national strategy for financial literacy. So, you can do program for all, and also you can be coordinating and try to make sure that many of the programs work together. It really, there is this phrase, it takes a village to educate a child. And I think it takes a country to financially educate this population. It's a collaboration within, the public sector, the private sector, and I would say everybody.
I think that's we should come back to that later on, because there's a lot of debate, I think, to be had about what works best. And as you mentioned, one of the questions that's come in from the audience around this topic is already relating to that. And do please, audience, keep your questions coming. I will slot them in at various points during our conversation, as well as probably in a section at the end. Florent, I'm sorry to keep you waiting for so long. I just wanted to hear your thoughts as well on this topic of the kind of financial stress that has been caused by the pandemic, which, as well as the digitalization that we've seen accelerate, there is that point. I know it's often a tangent from our core topic today, but there is clear correlations there between financial stress and financial literacy shortfalls.
Absolutely, Patrick. And I'm happy to say that I completely agree with what Anna Maria said. Actually, we've run 2 types of survey for adults and micro entrepreneurs. And in both areas, one important point that I want to highlight is that financial literacy is low across the board. So although some groups are particularly in particular difficult situation, women, young people, elderly people, that I would like to mention that are also in difficulty, especially because of digitalization, also migrant population. But overall, the level of financial literacy is low. And importantly, financial literacy is correlated with financial resilience. So we have an indicator of financial resilience that is looking at whether people have a buffer, have a small saving in case something bad happened. In the case of the pandemic, it was something bad happening for quite a long period of time. And the finding is that financial resilience is also low, and is particularly low for some group of the population with lower level of financial literacy. So there is a strong correlation between financial literacy level and what we measure in terms of financial resilience. We also see in those surveys that level of financial well-being are also low for similar groups of the population. Again, women, elderly population. So they are under considerable financial stress, especially because of the pandemic. So now we've said that digitalization is maybe reinforcing the stress. I would like also to say that it is an opportunity. It is a great opportunity for financial education, for better financial education outcomes. And actually, policymakers in all the countries, including Italy here or the UK, have actually really used digital tools in order to deliver financial education that was more personalized to target audience. Because Anna Maria is completely right. Although everybody needs financial literacy, we shouldn't deliver financial education in the same way to each group of the population. Each target audience really needs to be delivered with a message and the tools that is really specific to their situation. And in a sense, digitalization and digital tools are really offering us this opportunity. So we do believe that it's been, and it is something that we are really stressing in our report, that for young people, especially kids, you can, use gamification, for example, and it has proved to be really impactful in terms of developing skills. For teachers, you can use, also training online, and there are a lot of possibilities out there in terms of budgeting, in terms also, of networking. So very important to stress that indeed there are new risks, new exclusion, new discrimination coming from digitalization, but we can also take the benefit out of digitalization to make financial education more impactful and work better. And I would say especially true perhaps for young generation that are more digitally savvy than elderly population. And again, just to end on that, and Anna is really chairing a committee that is responsible for that. In order for financial literacy to work, it should be both targeted and at the same time becoming a policy at the national level. So a policy that is integrated into other policies, what we call at the OECD a national strategy for financial literacy, where the government is taking the leads, assessing the needs and the gap in the population, setting priorities, and then partnering with others, the private sector, the civil society, in order to deliver financial education that will have an impact in levels of financial literacy and financial well-being.
Before we go any further, I should declare my own hand here. I am not an entirely objective moderator because aside from my role as Deputy Editor of the FT, as you both know, Anna Maria and Florent, I also chair the nascent charity that the Financial Times has set up, the Financial Literacy and Inclusion Campaign, which is very keen to be working in these areas of education. So just full disclosure on that. Hopefully not a controversial point. I wondered if, Florent, I could stay with you for one other point, and then I want to address some of the questions after that that the audience has submitted. And the question is around trust. So the last time we had a kind of global crisis back in 2008, it was pretty well known that levels of trust in the financial services industry, particularly in banking, declined markedly. I wondered what your research might have shown in terms of what has happened through this pandemic, because it's a really interesting and important point, isn't it, when we're talking about financial literacy and, for example, the trustworthiness of the banking industry to be a provider of that education.
Thank you very much, Patrick. It's quite a comprehensive question. In terms of trust is really the foundation of our economic, financial society, actually. And without trust, we know that societies and the economic system is not functioning that well. It is so important that at the OECD, one of our flagship publications was really focusing on trust in business and finance a couple of years ago. So we have done a considerable amount of work on that. And one of the findings of this flagship publication is that, of course, each crisis is testing the trust of citizens and consumers. And the current crisis we are facing is not an exception, obviously. What we have been mentioning with Patrick, Anna Maria, and myself is that, the pandemic has actually crystallized some existing vulnerabilities and aggravated some others. And in a sense, at the same time, it has pushed digitalization very hard and make it all digital, creating some risk, as we mentioned, in terms of exclusion, but also abuses and fraud, and kind of testing really consumers' trust in the system. And we've seen that actually because we've conducted some survey during the crisis. Indeed, the level of trust in the financial system has decreased a bit, I would say. And in particular, consumers are reporting being more victims of fraud and abuses. So here, obviously, there is something to be done in terms of not only educating and informing, but also better protecting consumers. Now, the second part of your question, Patrick, was more about around the trust in the financial institution to provide financial education, if I understood correctly. And I'm coming to that, don't worry. So what we're saying at the OECD, as I mentioned, is that we need a whole policy agenda on financial literacy. It's not enough to have a few programs here and there to make a difference. But in that national policy, we need all stakeholders. We need the government to take the leadership, but we need the private sector to be involved very, very clearly. Why? Very simply because they have the expertise, they have the resources, they have the interest, and they have the reach. So they are very close to their own customers at the very least, so that's an advantage. Now, obviously, we're not naive about the situation. We know that conflicts of interest are existing. And what we're saying is that they simply need to be managed well with, for example, codes of conduct. And this has been implemented in a number of countries successfully. I can mention Portugal, Spain, or Canada. Why it's been so successful in those countries? Mostly because they have integrated the private sector, and namely the banking sector, the insurance sector, when they were creating their national strategy for financial education. So they have involved them in this process of creating this new policy agenda, of assessing the needs of the population, and giving them the task to implement part of this national agenda. And then they build codes of conduct together with the industry. So the idea is really it's a public-private partnership. So the involvement of the private sector should be complete in a sense. And the respect of the codes of conduct is actually one of the conditions in the three countries for the banks or the financial institution to be part of the national plan on financial education. So indeed, we shouldn't be completely, we shouldn't trust blindly, but I think, trusting with well-informed, well-educated consumers is actually working. And it's win-win for, obviously, the consumers, but also for the private sector.
Yes, that's a very good point, that there needs to be a cocktail of provision, and they need to be part of it, absolutely. There's a neat segue actually to Anna Maria and the question of what evidentially works in terms of financial literacy education. You've done a study, I think, of more than 30 countries' programs around the world. Tell us, we haven't got a huge amount of time, but tell us in a nutshell, if you could, what you found through that research.
Yes, we were interested in figuring this question out because we always get these questions. And so we look at the evidence in as many as 33 countries, which also include the developing countries, not just the OECD countries. And we look at the most rigorous program, the one done with randomized control trials, so you can really have a rigorous evaluation. And I think the evidence is very clear, which is that financial education does work, and it is also cost effective, which is, I think, very important. We also evaluated the cost because, of course, program can work, but are they too expensive to implement? And we found that they work across age groups, across countries, and across time. This is in contrast with previous studies. And I think it's because now that we have learned more about how to make financial education effective, we have been able to make it effective. For example, we know that financial education is very low. And so if you implement it in school where you can reach a lot of young people, it's going to be more effective. And we know that previously, financial education in school was without a rigorous curriculum, without the teacher being trained and so on. So I think we have learned a lot how to make financial education effective. And the evidence, I think, is coming out as being very effective. So I think it is very encouraging. People say, it's expensive to do financial education. And after that research, I would say it is expensive not to do it.
Yeah, that's a very powerful point. I just wanted to bring in now a few of the questions that have come in from the audience. One, just to put you on the spot, Florane, and I know you're here as a spokesperson for the OECD and not for France. Nonetheless, a question comes in about France, and what about the French strategy on financial literacy education? The questioner says, is there still nothing in the curriculum?
So it is not exactly true. First, there is now a national strategy for financial literacy in France. For a number of years, I was, leading the work on financial literacy and the policy agenda globally, and nothing much was happening in my country. But I'm happy to report that there is a national strategy for financial literacy, and Banque de France, the Central Bank of France, is actually leading that strategy together with the Ministry of Finance and Economy, and really trying to introduce some element of financial literacy in the curriculum. So for that, as always, they're trying to partner with the Ministry of Education. I have to say that the French curricula is no exception. It's quite crowded. So they are trying to find smart ways to include it in several subjects. It's not, I would say, perfect as yet, but certainly there is some progress there, and certainly more needs to be done. But you need to start somewhere in a sense. And I have to say that a lot of countries like France are really struggling with the introduction of financial education in school. So I completely agree with Anna that it is absolutely essential, and it is one of our recommendations at the OECD that financial education should start as early as possible and in schools in order to make a difference. Now, curriculum are crowded, so countries need to be kind of creative to introduce financial literacy in schools using other subjects, and this is what France is trying to do, like other countries. But I would say that you shouldn't limit yourself to that. You should train the teachers, provide good pedagogical tools in order to make sure that it is a success. And ideally, I would say make sure it is part of the final examination of students, because this is what is going to ultimately make a difference.
Okay. And Anna Maria, a final question for you, if I could. Another question from a member of the audience. Financial literacy, does that always go hand in hand with financial inclusion?
Well, the academic evidence show that it's linked to financial inclusion, meaning that if people are more informed, they are using more financial instruments. For example, we find that people who have higher financial literacy are more likely, for example, to invest in the stock market, but they are also more likely to better use these financial instruments. But I think, and I see a lot of the question here, I think, people feel, we are not saying that financial literacy is this solution to all of the problems, that is the only problem in a ecosystem. Of course, we think that, to promote financial inclusion, there are many other things that can be done. But as Florane said, it is really a win-win for everybody is if people have that basic knowledge that allows them, first of all, to understand the world around them, to take advantage of the opportunity offered by the market. For example, when interest rates go down, that was a good time, for example, to refinance, to, for example, be better able to manage your debt. And at the same time, not suffer from, potentially buying financial products that are not appropriate for your needs. So it is a first line of defense, but you win a game by having a good teamwork. And so people live in an ecosystem, and the entire ecosystem has to work well. But financial literacy is a critical ingredient. It brings a lot of good outcomes: financial inclusions, better use of financial product, and also better use of financial advisors.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk a lot more about this topic and exactly what the right mix of providers is. We've talked about schools as being crucial. We've talked about banks playing their part. Obviously, I would say there's a role for charities like our FT Flick to play a role as well as obviously the crucial work that both of you do. So let's hope that if there hasn't been an improvement in financial literacy levels over the past decades, that maybe now is the time when it will improve. There's certainly a lot of effort going into it all around the world. Thank you very much, Anna Maria and Florent, for joining us today. And to the audience, I hope you enjoy the rest of the Banking Revolution conference. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.